On a humid night in July of 1987, something shifted quietly in Memphis, Tennessee. It did not begin with a shootout, a police raid, or a gang war spilling into the streets. It began with movement, men leaving their usual corners, cars circling blocks they rarely crossed, routines breaking without explanation. By the end of that summer, 12 men connected to the city's drug trade would be dead, scattered across alleys, abandoned buildings, and empty parking lots within a tight stretch of South Memphis. They did not die together, they did not die loudly, and they did not die at the hands of a rival crew, a cartel, or law enforcement. The perpetrators were never identified, never charged, never even clearly named. Officially, the city called it a sequence of drug-related homicides. Unofficially, residents noticed something far stranger. The violence stopped exactly when it seemed meant to stop. At the center of it all was a family no one had been watching. No criminal record, no reputation, no ambition for territory or power. Just a household that believed staying quiet was the same as staying safe, until a single moment of disrespect made that impossible. Memphis authorities would later describe the summer as an unexplained collapse within the drug ecosystem. Locals still call it something else entirely, because it wasn't about drugs, it wasn't about money, and it wasn't a war that had been building for years. It was one boundary crossed on the wrong street, and a response that the city never found a language for. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Memphis, in 1987, breathed through cracked windows and neon reflections. The Mississippi River moved heavy and indifferent along the city's edge, while Beale Street pulsed with music that never fully drowned out the sirens. The city was caught in a specific moment in American history, the late Cold War years, when factories were thinning out, neighborhoods were hardening inward, and the crack cocaine economy had begun to redraw invisible borders street by street. By spring of that year, Memphis police reports were already recording a sharp rise in drug-related homicides, most of them clustered in South Memphis and the neighborhoods stretching east toward Orange Mound. Local newspapers used phrases like open-air markets and gang-linked disputes, but residents used simpler language. They talked about corners that changed hands overnight, about houses that stopped being homes, about music getting quieter earlier in the evening. The Browns lived just far enough from those corners to pretend distance still existed. Their house sat on a narrow residential street lined with modest brick homes built after World War II, when Memphis expanded to accommodate returning veterans and factory workers. By the late 1980s, many of those factories were gone or automated, but the houses remained, aging structures holding families that had learned to survive by routine. The Browns were one of those families, not prominent, not poor enough to attract attention, just present. Calvin Brown, the father, worked maintenance shifts at a distribution warehouse near the rail yards. He left before dawn and returned after dark, his hands smelling of grease and industrial cleaner. His wife, Lorraine, ran a daycare out of their living room for neighborhood parents who worked nights or double shifts. Their sons, Marcus, Elijah, and Thomas, had grown up inside that rhythm: school, church on Sundays, basketball at the park until the streetlights flickered on. Nothing about the Browns suggested confrontation, but 1987 was a year when proximity mattered more than intention. 2 blocks south of the Brown Street, a row of abandoned houses had been quietly repurposed. What had once been porches and family rooms became points of exchange. Cash moved quickly. Names were rarely spoken twice. Cars slowed, stopped, and disappeared again. The men who controlled that stretch were not a formal gang in the sense police task forces preferred, but they operated with shared rules, shared suppliers, and shared consequences. Memphis had seen this pattern before, but crack accelerated it. Smaller quantities, faster addiction, tighter territory. Violence no longer announced itself. It arrived sudden and precise. The Browns knew the sound of gunfire. Everyone did, but they had never been part of it. Until the night of June 12th. That evening began without urgency. The heat pressed down early, heavy and unmoving. The kind of Memphis summer air that made shirts cling to skin before sunset. Lorraine closed the daycare at 6. Calvin wasn't due home until close to midnight. Marcus, 22, had borrowed the car to take his younger sister Denise to a friend's birthday party a few streets over. Elijah and Thomas sat on the front steps, talking in low voices, watching the neighborhood breathe. It was Denise who changed everything. She was 17, careful in the way teenagers are careful when they grow up surrounded by rules. She had been raised to avoid certain streets, certain names, certain looks, but avoidance did not mean invisibility. When Marcus pulled up outside the house where the party was being held, a rented duplex with loud music and too many cars, Denise hesitated before getting out. Inside, the music was loud enough to blur conversations. It was a mix of local radio hits and slow jams, the kind played on repeat at summer parties across the South. People crowded the living room. Someone passed drinks. Someone laughed too hard. It was ordinary, until it wasn't. The man who kissed Denise was not invited by anyone she knew. He was older, mid-20s at least, and he smelled of cologne layered over sweat. He leaned in close under the pretense of conversation and pressed his mouth against hers without asking. It lasted less than a second, but it landed heavy. Witnesses later described what followed as confusion. Denise shoved him away. Voices rose. Someone recognized the man and said his name, quietly, like a warning. Marcus moved fast, placing himself between them, grabbing Denise's hand. They left before the argument could form into something else. They did not know the man was connected. They did not know that in 1987, a moment like that could travel faster than reason. By the time Calvin returned home near midnight, the house was awake. Denise sat at the kitchen table, her arms folded tight against her chest. Marcus stood near the sink, replaying the story in clipped sentences. Elijah and Thomas listened without interrupting. Lorraine watched her daughter's face more than her words. Calvin said very little. He asked one question. "Did anyone follow you?" And then he nodded once, as if answering himself. In Memphis that year, retaliation rarely came immediately. It announced itself in small signs first. A car idling too long at the corner, a stranger asking casual questions, a name mentioned twice. Within 48 hours, the Browns noticed those signs. A blue sedan passed the house 3 times one afternoon, slowing near the driveway. Someone knocked on the door and asked for a person who had never lived there. Marcus overheard 2 men talking at the gas station about the girl on Jefferson Street. The words were not threatening, but they were precise. Memphis police logs from that week would later record unrelated incidents. A shooting near Lamar Avenue, a drug bust on Beale, a body found behind an auto shop. Nothing tied directly to the Browns, nothing yet. But families did not need police confirmation to recognize danger. Calvin called a family meeting that night. No raised voices, no dramatics, just instructions. Denise would not leave the house alone. The boys would move together. Lights stayed on. Doors stayed locked. This was not fear, Calvin insisted. It was awareness. The Browns believed, as many did, that restraint still mattered, that boundaries could be re-established, that a stolen kiss did not justify escalation. What they did not know was that the men who controlled the 2 blocks south were already counting the slight differently. In their world, disrespect traveled with interest. And by the end of June 1987, 12 names would be written into Memphis history, quietly, incompletely, connected not by paperwork, but by a chain of decisions that began with a moment no one thought would matter. The city would later call it a drug-related purge. Neighbors would call it something else. The Browns would never call it anything at all. By the last week of June, Memphis had slipped into a familiar rhythm of tension. Summer always did that. Heat shortened tempers, stretched nights, and kept people awake long enough to witness things they would later deny seeing. In 1987, the city was already under pressure. Federal anti-drug funding had increased patrols, but it had also fragmented enforcement. Uniformed presence pushed activity deeper into residential zones instead of eliminating it. For the men operating south of Jefferson Street, pressure did not mean retreat, it meant consolidation. They met in places that did not look like meeting places: a shuttered barber shop, a detached garage behind a boarded-up duplex. Conversations were short, decisions were quicker. In those rooms, the incident involving Denise Brown was not framed as confusion or misjudgment. It was framed as humiliation. Witnesses from that circle would later tell investigators that the kiss was never the point. The point was that someone had intervened publicly, that a family without standing had created a moment where authority looked uncertain. That could not be left unanswered. The Browns, meanwhile, continued to live inside routine, but the routine had changed shape. Marcus stopped going out at night entirely. Elijah switched shifts at the grocery warehouse where he worked, trading evenings for early mornings. Thomas, still in high school, stayed home after practice instead of lingering at the courts. Denise did not attend summer programs. Lorraine temporarily shut down the daycare. These decisions were quiet. They drew no attention, but they did not go unnoticed. On July 1st, Calvin was approached at work by a man he did not know. The conversation lasted less than a minute. The man asked if Calvin lived on Jefferson Street, asked if he had children, said nothing else, walked away before Calvin could respond. That night, Calvin did something he had not done since returning from military service years earlier. He locked himself in the bedroom and opened a metal footlocker stored beneath the bed. Inside were documents, folded uniforms, and a handgun he had not fired in over a decade. He checked it, unloaded it, and returned it to the case. He did not tell Lorraine. Memphis in 1987 still carried traces of older survival logic. Many families, particularly black working-class families, maintained layered responses to danger. Avoidance first, silence second, preparation last. Police were contacted when property disappeared, when threats remained abstract. But when danger felt personal, families often handled it internally, not because of bravado, because of precedent. 2 nights later, a bottle shattered against the Browns' front porch. No note, no message, just broken glass and the sound of tires accelerating into the distance. Neighbors heard it but did not come outside. By morning, the fragments were swept into a trash bag and carried to the curb. That same day, Memphis police responded to 3 separate shootings within a mile radius of Jefferson Street. None resulted in arrests. All were logged as suspected narcotics disputes. The pattern was tightening. Inside the Browns' house, conversation changed. It became shorter, less explanatory. Marcus began sleeping on the couch near the front window. Elijah took responsibility for locking doors and checking the backyard fence each night. Thomas started carrying a baseball bat when he walked Denise to the bus stop for her summer job orientation. An orientation she would never attend. The family still believed the situation could dissipate, that boundaries could be reasserted without confrontation. They were wrong. On July 6th, just after dusk, a group of men approached the house while Calvin was at work. They did not knock. They stood on the sidewalk and called Marcus's name. Not loudly, not angrily, just loud enough to be heard. Marcus did not answer. Lorraine watched through the curtain as the men spoke among themselves, pointing at the house, then leaving without incident. The encounter lasted less than 2 minutes, but it erased any remaining illusion that this was a misunderstanding. From that moment forward, the Browns stopped reacting and started planning. There was no formal discussion about violence, no speeches, no declarations. What happened instead was practical. Calvin contacted 2 relatives who lived outside the city. Arrangements were made for Denise to leave within days. Elijah took time off work. Marcus borrowed a vehicle from a friend under a different name. Calvin did not contact police. In Memphis at that time, cooperation with law enforcement in drug-related conflicts often produced consequences before it produced protection. Informants were exposed. Calls were leaked. Patrols arrived late. The Browns understood that reporting a threat without proof would place them inside a system that could not shield them. On July 8th, Denise left the city before sunrise, riding north with a cousin toward Missouri. She hugged her mother tightly and her brothers briefly. Calvin watched from the doorway as the car disappeared, knowing the act itself would be noticed. That same afternoon, the first death occurred. A man known locally as Reggie Cole was found behind a closed convenience store 3 blocks south of Jefferson Street. He had been shot twice at close range. No wallet, no weapon. The police report listed time of death between noon and 2 p.m. No witnesses. Cole was connected to the group that had been circling the Browns' house. Within 24 hours, 2 more men from the same circle were killed in separate locations. Different weapons, different circumstances, same outcome. Memphis newspapers did not connect the incidents. They appeared on different pages, brief mentions, names misspelled, ages approximated, each death described as part of an ongoing drug war. Inside the Browns' house, the atmosphere changed again, not to relief, but to certainty. This was no longer about deterrence. It was escalation. The killings continued through July, not nightly, not predictably. Sometimes days passed without incident. Then, 2 bodies would appear within hours, one found in a vehicle, another in an alley, a third collapsed inside an abandoned house. Police task forces increased patrols. Federal agencies took interest, but the pattern defied easy explanation. There was no single suspect, no consistent method, no claims of responsibility. By mid-July, 7 men tied to the same drug distribution network were dead. The Browns remained inside their house. They did not celebrate. They did not speak about what was happening, but they stopped sleeping. Every sound outside was cataloged. Every car engine was evaluated. Calvin finally told Lorraine about the gun. She did not argue. By July 18th, Memphis was uneasy. Rumors moved faster than facts. Some said a rival crew had moved in from out of state. Others whispered about ex-military involvement. A few said it was the police themselves, cleaning up quietly. No one said the Browns' name, but everyone south of Jefferson Street felt the shift. Territory went quiet. Corners emptied. Houses once active went dark. The men who remained armed themselves and stayed inside. They were waiting for something to stop. It didn't. By the end of July, 12 men were dead. All had ties to narcotics distribution. All operated within a narrow geographic band. All had been present, directly or indirectly, on the night of June 12th. The connection was never proven, but in Memphis, proof was not always required for belief. And inside one modest brick house on Jefferson Street, a family understood that whatever line had been crossed could never be uncrossed. The city had begun counting bodies. The Browns were counting nights. By August of 1987, Memphis authorities could no longer treat the deaths as isolated incidents. 12 men connected by geography, timing, and association had been killed in less than 6 weeks. Even in a city accustomed to violence linked to narcotics, the efficiency of the pattern stood out. What troubled investigators most was not the number of deaths. It was the absence of noise. There were no retaliatory shootings in response, no public threats, no graffiti, no intercepted communications suggesting a turf war. The network that had operated south of Jefferson Street simply collapsed, as if someone had reached into the structure and removed its spine piece by piece. Police reports began using new language, non-random, surgical, externally motivated. A joint task force was assembled quietly. Memphis police worked alongside county detectives and a small federal narcotics unit already stationed in Tennessee due to increased trafficking along Interstate 40. They reviewed ballistics first, expecting consistency. Instead, they found variation, different calibers, different trajectories, different distances. What remained consistent was location choice. The killings happened in transitional spaces, alleys, parking lots, abandoned properties, vehicles stopped at intersections just long enough to be vulnerable, places where witnesses were unlikely and escape routes were plentiful. Someone had done reconnaissance. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods. They spoke to shop owners, church elders, sanitation workers. They asked the same questions repeatedly. Who had been seen together? Who had disappeared suddenly? Who had changed routines? What they encountered instead was silence layered over fear. In 1987, Memphis, silence did not always signal loyalty. Often it signaled survival. Residents had learned that speaking without certainty could invite attention without protection. Many answered questions politely and said nothing meaningful. Others declined entirely. Still, patterns emerged. Several witnesses mentioned unfamiliar vehicles appearing briefly and vanishing. A brown pickup, a gray sedan, a station wagon that never parked for long. None were registered locally. None were captured clearly on security cameras, which were rare and unreliable at the time. Investigators also noticed something else. The killings stopped abruptly. After July 29th, there were no further deaths tied to the collapsed network. No attempts to reclaim territory. No new leadership. The streets remained quiet. It was as if the objective had been completed. This pause unsettled law enforcement more than continued violence would have. In drug-related conflicts, silence usually preceded retaliation. Here, silence followed finality. Attention turned inward. Internal Affairs reviewed recent arrests, releases, and disciplinary actions. They found nothing that explained the scope. No officer had access to all 12 targets. No unit operated with that level of autonomy. The theory of covert police involvement was quietly dismissed. The next theory was outside intervention. Federal agencies had, in the past, worked indirectly with informants whose actions exceeded instruction. But there were no corresponding seizures, no indictments, no intelligence suggesting an undercover operation gone wrong. The killings were not part of a broader cleanup. They were specific. On August 11th, a detective noticed a detail that shifted the focus slightly. Every victim, according to interviews and surveillance reconstructions, had been present in some form at a party on June 12th, or had direct contact with someone who was. The party itself had never been reported. It had dissolved without incident. No police calls, no arrests. But it was the only common point. Investigators began reconstructing that night. They identified the location, interviewed residents, collected fragments of memory. Most descriptions were vague. Loud music, too many people, drinks passed freely, a brief confrontation near the front door. One name surfaced repeatedly, though no one volunteered it easily. A man connected to the group who had initiated the unwanted contact with a younger woman. That man had been the fourth to die. The woman's identity remained unclear in the reports. She was described only as a minor female, removed from the scene by a male relative. No complaint was filed. No follow-up was documented. In a city where underreporting was common, the incident had been treated as resolved the moment the involved parties left. But now, months later, it reappeared as a possible origin point. Detectives asked a different question: who had intervened? Marcus Brown's name appeared once, buried inside a witness statement that went nowhere. A young man, quiet, left quickly, no criminal history, lived nearby. When investigators attempted to contact him, they were told he was unavailable. No further details. The Browns had already adjusted again. By mid-August, Marcus no longer slept in the house consistently. Elijah and Thomas rotated nights staying with relatives. Calvin maintained his work schedule, but he changed routes, times, habits. Lorraine reopened the daycare partially, careful about who she accepted. Nothing about the Browns drew official attention. They did not flee. They did not profit. They did not speak. This absence of reaction was both their shield and their shadow. On September 2nd, an anonymous tip reached the task force. The caller suggested the killings were not the work of a rival gang, but of a family who knew how to move without being seen. No names were given. The call disconnected. The tip was logged and deprioritized. Without physical evidence, prosecutors had nothing to pursue. Ballistics did not connect. No weapons were recovered. No witnesses stepped forward with certainty. The victims themselves, tied to narcotics distribution, did not generate public pressure for resolution. By October, the task force was quietly dismantled. Resources were reassigned. The case fragments were archived under separate files. Officially, the Memphis homicides of summer 1987 remained unsolved. Unofficially, something else happened. The neighborhoods south of Jefferson Street changed. Drug activity did not return in the same form. Corners stayed quiet longer than expected. New operators avoided the area entirely. The memory of that summer lingered without explanation. The Browns stayed. Denise did not return until the following year, and even then only briefly. She never spoke publicly about what happened. She did not need to. Within the family, the events of 1987 were never discussed as a story. They were treated as a period, a season that had passed. But seasons leave residue. Calvin aged quickly in the years that followed. Marcus moved away in the early 1990s. Elijah married and left the neighborhood. Thomas joined the military. Lorraine remained in the house the longest. Memphis moved on, as cities do. New violence replaced old. New names filled the papers. The summer of 1987 became a footnote. But for investigators who had been close enough to see the outline without the center, the case remained unsettled. They understood that something had happened that did not fit the usual explanations. A line had been crossed, and whatever response followed had been measured, deliberate, and finite. The city had almost understood, but almost was not enough. What separated the summer of 1987 from every other violent season Memphis had endured was not brutality. It was restraint. Violence in the city's history usually announced itself. It escalated loudly, chaotically, driven by impulse, drugs, ego, or panic. What unfolded after June 12th followed a different logic, one that suggested planning shaped by limits rather than rage. That distinction mattered. Investigators who revisited the case years later would note that none of the 12 killings appeared opportunistic. No robberies gone wrong, no arguments that spiraled, no collateral victims. Each act ended precisely where it began. One target, one conclusion. That kind of outcome required more than anger. Inside the Browns' household, the shift toward discipline began quietly. After Denise left the city, the family stopped thinking in terms of safety and started thinking in terms of containment. Not retaliation, not revenge, containment. Calvin's military background, though unremarkable on paper, mattered in practice. He had served stateside logistics and transport during the late Vietnam era. He was not a combat veteran, but he understood planning, movement, timing, and the importance of not leaving traces. More importantly, he understood the danger of improvisation. Whatever decisions were made in that house followed a single principle. Nothing could be traced back to them. That principle governed everything. Vehicles were borrowed, never owned. Routes changed daily. No one returned home immediately after leaving a location. Conversations were brief and never repeated the same way twice. The family did not act together in public. They did not cluster. They did not draw patterns. Most importantly, they did not act quickly. The first death occurred only after days of observation. The target had been identified as someone who moved alone regularly, who did not carry protection consistently, and who had predictable habits. The location, a closed convenience store, was chosen because it allowed approach without visibility and exit without obstruction. After that, the pattern expanded, but never recklessly. What the city interpreted as randomness was, in fact, spacing. Days passed between incidents not because of hesitation, but because of recalibration. Each action was followed by a pause, a test of response, a check for attention. When patrols increased, activity shifted locations. When rumors spread, activity slowed. The objective was never dominance, it was finality. This is where the common narrative failed. If the Browns had been seeking revenge, they would have acted emotionally, loudly, publicly. Instead, the violence followed a narrowing arc, focused entirely on individuals connected to the initial incident, either directly present or structurally responsible. 12 men, no more, no less. The choice to stop after the 12th death remains the most revealing detail of all. Drug networks rarely dissolve cleanly. There are always replacements, rivals, opportunists. But in this case, the message was not territorial, it was personal, and once delivered, it ended. Within the family, the cost was immediate and lasting. Marcus, who had intervened instinctively on June 12th, carried the weight most visibly. He became quieter, more detached. Friends noticed he no longer spoke about the future. When he left Memphis 2 years later, he did not explain why. He simply stopped returning calls. Elijah internalized responsibility differently. He became rigid, controlled. He married young, moved to a smaller town, and avoided conversations about his past. Those who knew him later described him as disciplined to the point of isolation. Thomas chose structure. The military offered clarity, rules, and distance. He enlisted not out of patriotism, but because it provided a framework where decisions followed orders, not emotion. Lorraine bore a different burden. She maintained the appearance of normalcy. She reopened the daycare. She attended church. She smiled when neighbors asked about her children. But those close to her noticed that she never again allowed unfamiliar adults near her family without scrutiny. Calvin never spoke about the summer after it ended. In private moments, he dismantled and reassembled the handgun he had retrieved from storage, not to use it, but to ensure it functioned. Then one day, it disappeared from the house entirely. No one ever asked where it went. From the outside, the Browns looked like a family that had survived a scare. From the inside, they understood something else had happened, something irreversible. Years later, a retired detective would remark in an off-the-record conversation that the case bothered him not because it was unsolved, but because it was too resolved. Every other open case he carried felt incomplete. This one felt finished. The absence of noise after July 1987 was not coincidence, it was confirmation. The city had received the message without ever hearing the words. By the early 1990s, younger officers no longer knew the details. The names blurred, files gathered dust. New drug economies reshaped Memphis in different ways. Violence returned, but it returned differently. The Browns faded into the city's background. No charges were ever filed, no arrests made, no documentaries produced. The story survived only in fragments. Rumors passed quietly, recollections shared in trusted company, a sense that something had once gone very wrong and then stopped. That was the discipline behind the silence. Not chaos, not rage, control. And control, once exercised, demanded a price. Time did not close the summer of 1987. It stretched it. Memphis moved forward on paper. New mayors, new initiatives, new task forces, but memory did not follow policy. What happened south of Jefferson Street settled into the city like humidity, invisible but persistent. People who lived through it carried the knowledge without language for it. People who arrived later sensed it without understanding why. For the Browns, the aftermath did not arrive as relief. It arrived as maintenance. The first year after the killings was the hardest, not because of fear of arrest, but because of the slow return of normalcy. Normal sounds felt wrong. Laughter felt out of place. Silence felt earned, not peaceful. Calvin continued working the warehouse until his body no longer cooperated. He declined promotions. He avoided social gatherings. Co-workers described him as reliable, but distant. No one at work knew anything about the summer. They only knew he began leaving earlier and speaking less. At home, routines hardened. Doors were checked even when daylight made it unnecessary. Windows stayed covered longer than before. Conversations avoided the past by mutual agreement. This was not denial. It was containment again, applied inward. Lorraine resumed her role in the neighborhood carefully. She never asked questions she did not want answered. She never lingered in gossip. Parents trusted her with their children because she watched closely and spoke little. Over time, people stopped associating her house with that year at all. That, in Memphis, was survival. Marcus left first. In 1989, he accepted a job several states away, work that required constant travel and no fixed address. Friends assumed he was chasing opportunity. In reality, he was chasing distance. Wherever he went, he kept his life narrow. Few connections, no long-term commitments. He never married, never returned permanently. When asked later why he left Memphis, he said only that the city felt finished to him. Elijah's life followed a different arc. He sought stability aggressively, marriage, children, a mortgage in a town where people locked doors out of habit, not necessity. He became dependable to the point of invisibility. To his co-workers, he was predictable. To his family, he was guarded. Thomas returned from military service quieter than when he left. Discipline suited him, but it also reinforced something already embedded. He stayed in structured environments, avoided unpredictability, and spoke carefully. When his children asked about Memphis, he described the music, the food, the river. He never described the summer. Denise carried the event differently than any of them. She had been the axis, but she did not inherit the silence. She inherited vigilance. She finished school outside Tennessee. She avoided crowded spaces. She never allowed unfamiliar men close enough to surprise her. Friends described her as composed but distant. She did not romanticize the past. She did not seek explanation. She simply lived as someone who understood how quickly things could shift. Years later, when asked by a counselor whether she blamed herself for what followed, she paused before answering. She said blame required choice. She had not chosen. That answer ended the conversation. By the late 1990s, Memphis had changed again. New drug routes, new players, new violence. The events of 1987 were now history to anyone under 30. Even among older residents, the memory had thinned. But the consequences remained embedded in the Browns' lives in ways that did not fade. Every family gathering carried an unspoken rule. The past would not be reconstructed, not because it hurt, but because reconstruction invited distortion, and distortion invited exposure. They understood something the city never formally acknowledged. Closure did not come from explanation. It came from endurance. Occasionally, someone from law enforcement would circle back, a cold case review, a grant-funded reevaluation, questions asked with professional detachment. Each time, the answers were the same. Limited memory, no knowledge, no involvement. The truth was never contradicted because it was never spoken. In 2003, a journalist researching urban violence in the late 1980s noted the anomaly in Memphis data: 12 connected deaths, no retaliation, no arrests, no resurgence. He requested access to files. He received fragments. In his final article, he described the period as an unexplained interruption. He did not name the Browns. He could not. By then, Calvin had passed quietly in his sleep. Lorraine remained in the house for several more years before moving closer to grandchildren. When she left Jefferson Street for the last time, neighbors hugged her and wished her well. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. The house was sold, renovated, repainted. Nothing about it suggested history. But history does not require markers to persist. It requires memory, and memory, when disciplined enough, survives without witnesses. In the official records of Memphis, Tennessee, the summer of 1987 ends without punctuation. There is no concluding report, no consolidated case file, no courtroom transcript tying the 12 deaths together. What exists instead are fragments, incident numbers without continuation, autopsy reports filed under separate folders, patrol logs that show increased activity, and then a sudden return to baseline. From an institutional perspective, the city did what it always did when certainty failed. It moved on. But history is not only what is written, it is also what is deliberately left unfinished. By the time the Browns had fully dispersed into their separate lives, the conditions that made their story possible no longer existed in the same form. Crack cocaine would give way to other markets. Policing strategies would shift. Neighborhoods would gentrify or collapse. The logic of violence would mutate again. Yet one thing never changed. No one replaced the 12. In criminal ecosystems, absence is usually temporary. Vacuums attract ambition. But south of Jefferson Street, the territory remained unusually dormant for years. Activity returned slowly, cautiously, fragmented. Older men warned younger ones away from the area without explaining why. Names were not spoken. Questions were discouraged. This kind of behavioral residue does not come from myth. It comes from memory reinforced by consequence. Former detectives who revisited the killings decades later would admit privately that the case unsettled them because it contradicted professional assumptions. The perpetrators were never identified, but neither were they reckless. There was no signature, no ego, no escalation beyond the objective. It was not chaos. It was containment executed to completion. That reality forced an uncomfortable question, one no official document ever posed directly. What happens when a system fails to intervene and order is imposed outside of it? Not symbolically, not rhetorically, but quietly, with discipline, and then withdrawn. The Browns never sought recognition. They never told their story. They never corrected rumors or embraced myth. Their silence was not an attempt to control the narrative. It was an understanding that narratives create exposure. Exposure creates risk, and risk had already been resolved once. In later years, when Memphis journalists revisited unsolved violence from the 1980s, the case occasionally resurfaced as a statistical anomaly. 12 drug-linked deaths with no arrests and no follow-up crimes. Analysts debated rival crews, federal operations, even coincidence. None of those explanations accounted for the precision of the ending, because endings are intentional. Justice, in 1987 Memphis, did not arrive wearing a badge or carrying a warrant. It arrived in pieces, spread across weeks, invisible to anyone looking for a single event. It arrived without announcement and departed the same way. The Browns did not define it as justice. They did not define it at all. They lived with it, and that may be the most accurate record of all. Today, there is no plaque on Jefferson Street, no marker, no acknowledgement. Children play where patrol cars once idled. New families move into houses with no idea what occurred there decades earlier. The city remembers what it can use. It forgets what it cannot process. But in the margins, between archived files, between misfiled reports, between lives quietly redirected, the truth remains intact, not proven, not denied, simply preserved through absence. 12 men died, a family survived, and a city learned, briefly, that some lines once crossed are answered in ways no institution ever records.